She laughed aloud. Yet silence filled the air. Welcome to Mind Night, Detective. I am your host, Elderwick. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? Your voices make these mysteries unforgettable. Let's begin. The quadrangle was deserted, as if the college had drawn in its breath and forgotten to let it go. Rain lingered on the flagstones in dark squares, each reflecting a fragment of lantern light that seemed older than the buildings themselves. I remember standing beneath the archway, listening to the hesitant trickle from a broken gutter, and wondering why silence so often feels heavier than sound. I had been summoned by the bursar, though he had not used that word. Summoned implies clarity, purpose. His message had been more oblique, the kind of note that arrives on thick paper and appears almost ashamed of itself. A missing porter, he wrote. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps something. Would I care to call? The porter's name was Hardinge, 63. 15 years at the gate, his life spent in the rhythm of term and vacation, key and lock, complaint and apology. Few men disappear without trace. Fewer still from a place like this, where even footsteps are catalogued by walls of stone. I crossed the quadrangle slowly, each step accompanied by the faint echo of my shoes. I could almost hear the voices of scholars long gone, their debates carried on drafts that smelt of ink and old paper. The library windows, unlit at this hour, appeared like watchful eyes half closed against the rain. The bursar waited in his rooms, a pale figure among ledgers and decanters. He spoke too quickly, as though words might absolve him. Hardinger was last seen yesterday at dusk. He had taken his supper, exchanged a few words with the scout, and then nothing. His bed untouched, his cupboard still orderly, his bicycle resting in its habitual corner. No quarrels, no debts, at least none that anyone would admit, I asked after the keys. The bursar's lips tightened. The master keys remained locked in their cabinet. Yet one set, the porter's personal ring, was missing. So small matter, perhaps, yet it pressed upon the bursar's conscience like a misplaced zero in a column of accounts. Later, walking the cloister, I recalled a crossword clue I had left unfinished in that morning's paper. 5 letters beginning with L, meaning hidden. Latent, I thought suddenly. And in that instant, I considered that absence itself might conceal a shape just as much as presence. A man may leave not by walking, but by staying hidden where no one thinks to look. The rain had eased, leaving the air sweet with the scent of wet stone. I paused by the porter's lodge, its small lamp burning with unnecessary patience. Inside, the desk bore the signs of interrupted routine. A logbook half completed, spectacles folded neatly beside it. There was an entry in Harding's careful hand, noting a visitor's departure. A name struck through faintly, as though reconsidered. I touched the page and found the ink still slightly raised, though a day had passed. Was the name an error, or a truth he was not meant to preserve? I asked myself whether men of 63 suddenly decide upon freedom, abandoning keys and lodges and years of service. It is not impossible. But the handwriting told another story. The faint tremor of the pen, a hesitation before the strike-through. Guilt is often clumsy, while fear tends toward silence. This, I thought, was fear disguised as correction. I lingered in the quadrangle until the hour bell sounded. The college seemed to withdraw further into itself, doors closed, curtains drawn, the faint smell of supper drifting faintly from the hall. Somewhere beyond, a bicycle wheel creaked in the wind, though no rider passed. The empty space left by Hardinge was more than absence. It was an outline, sharp against the familiar fabric of the place. And outlines, I had learned long ago, demand to be filled. So I stood alone in the rain-polished quadrangle, thinking not of the man who had gone, but of the faint line of ink that remained. The evening had gathered in layers, soft and heavy, like velvet lowered over the college roofs. I found myself seated in the Sheldonian, though the concert had ended an hour before. The audience had dispersed, the musicians gone, and still I lingered as if waiting for some revelation from the stage. The echo of applause remained faint in the air, though I knew it was only my memory playing games with the acoustics. The bursar had pressed me to attend. Hardinger, he insisted, was often seen slipping into the gallery, content with the cheapest seat, content to watch others watching. A curious habit for a porter. Tonight's concert had offered no Hardinger. Only Schubert, followed by silence. A solitary figure appeared from the wings, arranging sheet music into a stack. The conductor himself, a gaunt man with a stoop that seemed more habitual than required. He greeted me with a nod that suggested both recognition and indifference. The porter. Yes, he used to stand back there near the emergency exit. Never caused trouble. Never stayed to speak. Quiet man. A man who understood shadows. I thought of the phrase curtain falls, that gentle euphemism for the end of a life. The program from tonight's performance lay folded in my pocket. On its back page, the sponsors were listed, their names bold against the cream paper. One name repeated, an endowment from a family I had heard in connection with the college. A thread perhaps, though faint. Outside, the cobbled streets gleamed with rain, and my own reflection moved beside me in the shop windows, a ghost tethered by habit to stone. I recalled a crossword clue from yesterday's Times. 8 letters. A word for disappearance. Vanish seemed too simple. Oblivion, I wondered. And yet oblivion is not merely going. It is the act of being forgotten. Hardinger had vanished, but no one had forgotten him. Not yet. The quadrangle met me again with its damp perfume of moss and iron. Light spilled from the hall where students lingered over port. Their laughter rose, then collapsed against the night. I walked to the lodge where Sergeant Lewis waited with his uneasy patience. He asked whether I had learned anything. Only that Hardinge loved music, I told him. And perhaps that is something, Lewis frowned. A man disappears and you give me Schubert? His words carried no malice, only frustration. I looked at him and said quietly that sometimes music tells us where a man's loyalties lie. We entered the lodge together. The spectacles remained, the logbook too, its pages resigned to their silence. But Lewis, with his blunt certainty, pointed out a detail I had overlooked. The page where Hardinger had struck through the visitor's name bore a faint indentation, as if his pen had lingered too long. Not merely hesitation, pressure, the kind of pressure exerted when one is watched. I bent close, tracing the groove with my finger. The name beneath the strike-through was one I recognized, though I could not at first place it. The letters blurred with the memory of other names, other cases. It returned slowly, like a face half seen in fog, a benefactor of the arts, patron of tonight's concert, his name appearing again and again in the footnotes of college life. If Hardinge had wished to erase the name, he had failed. Erasures are rarely successful, the paper remembers, just as the college remembers, with its archives and its ledgers and its porters, who never forget the comings and goings of strangers. Lewis asked what it meant. I told him it meant only that a porter had written what he should not, and then thought better of it. Or perhaps someone else thought better for him. We left the lodge, locking it behind us. The night was colder now, the air sharpened by the promise of frost. From across the quadrangle, the chapel bell began its slow tolling of the hour. Each note seemed to fall heavier than the last, as though it too were reluctant to end. In that moment, I realized the case was less about where Hardinge had gone, and more about why he had remained so long unseen in plain sight. Men like him live at the edges, silent guardians of thresholds. And when such men vanish, the thresholds themselves begin to tremble. The curtain had fallen, yes, but the play had not ended. There is always something faintly theatrical about a college gathering, even when the purpose is as mundane as a committee meeting. The actors arrive at different times, costumed in gowns or tweeds, their entrances calculated or careless, their voices tuned to the peculiar acoustics of old wood. That evening, as I was invited, again not summoned to sit in the senior common room, I thought less of governance and more of a rehearsal, lines spoken too often to be believed. The bursar introduced me as if I were a reluctant guest at a dinner party. Gentleman and lady, Inspector Morse of the Thames Valley Police. A murmur of acknowledgement, some eyes lifted briefly, others refusing to notice me at all. The fire crackled with too much enthusiasm for the mood of the room. The master presided lean and polished, a glass in his hand that was more prop than refreshment. The dean hovered near the mantelpiece, his mouth pursed as though on the edge of disapproval. A fellow of history leaned back, his chair dangerously angled, while a young lecturer in French seemed more absorbed by her cuticles than the matter at hand. They were the players, and I for the moment a member of the audience. Hardinger's absence was spoken of in tones carefully modulated between concern and dismissal. One cannot have porters disappearing, the dean remarked. It unsettles the rhythm of the place. The master nodded gravely, but his eyes flicked towards me with something that resembled irritation. I asked them to recall the last time each had spoken to Hardinge. Answers came hesitantly. The historian thought he had seen him outside the library 3 evenings ago. The lecturer shook her head. She never noticed. She never noticed. Porters. The dean muttered something about chapel duty. I listened, making no notes. I prefer the memory of cadence to the distraction of ink. A glass of claret was pressed upon me. I accepted, though I rarely drink in such company. The liquid glowed darkly in the lamplight, as though mocking the solemnity of our conversation. It was then that I observed the smallest of gestures. The master, in refilling his glass, allowed a drop to fall upon the carpet. No one else noticed, but his eyes followed the stain with undue attention, as though fearing that a trace, however slight, might betray more than clumsiness. Later, Lewis would ask me what I had seen in that room. I told him only that people who spill rarely care, but people who fear the mark do so because they know how long stains can last. The meeting continued with little resolution. They debated whether the police should be called openly or whether the matter could be managed discreetly. The bursar urged cooperation. The dean muttered about reputations. The French lecturer, in a moment of unexpected candor, asked whether it mattered at all. Men like Hardinge are invisible until they vanish, she said, and then we grieve only for the inconvenience. Her words silenced the room. For a second, the fire seemed to falter. I saw the master's gaze fix on her with quiet fury, but she met it without flinching. In that silent exchange lay more truth than in all the words spoken aloud. When at last I was permitted to withdraw, I carried with me not facts, but impressions. The echo of the historian's laughter, oddly misplaced. The French lecturer's remark, lingering like perfume in a deserted room. The stain of wine upon the carpet, each a fragment, none complete. On the walk back through the quadrangle, I recalled a crossword clue I had left half solved. 6 letters, a word for a group of actors. Troupe, I thought, or perhaps cast. Yet neither seemed right. Assemble, I realized, though not in the theatrical sense. To assemble is not only to gather, but to be placed deliberately. Each piece fitted with care, sometimes with force. The players had assembled, yes, but for what script and whose design remained hidden. I paused beneath the archway once more. The rain had ceased, but the stone still held its chill. In the silence, I heard faintly the imagined creak of floorboards in rooms above, footsteps rehearsing their parts. And I wondered whether Hardinge had been not an absence at all, but a cue. The curtain had lifted again, and the play had scarcely begun. The morning was grey and reluctant, the sort of day when Oxford seems to resist its own awakening. Puddles lingered in the gutters, and the bells tolled with a sluggish echo as though weighed down by the weather. I walked towards Broad Street with no clear intention, other than to trace again the outlines of a life that had ceased to be visible. At a small café, I paused for coffee, though what I wanted more was silence. A programme from the concert still lay folded in my pocket, its creases deepening with each hour. I drew it out and studied it again, more to distract myself from my thoughts than with any expectation of discovery. Yet there it was, so slight an error it might have gone unnoticed by anyone less inclined to look. The name of the second violinist was misspelt, the I transposed with an E. Careless, perhaps, but what lingered was the fact that Hardinge, so the bursar had said, kept every programme he collected, filed with the precision of a clerk. I wondered whether he would have noticed the error, and whether such noticing mattered more than it seemed. I thought of a crossword clue I had left unresolved. 7 letters beginning with A, meaning error in print. Her item, of course. But as I turned the programme in my hand, another word intruded, anagram. The letters reshuffled, the sense altered. What is a misprint? But the world briefly rearranging itself into a pattern that does not quite fit. Lewis joined me at the café, his presence announced by the scrape of a chair against the floor. He asked why I was staring at paper like a man staring at prophecy. I told him simply that words matter even when misplaced. He shook his head, accustomed to my evasions, and began instead to recite the facts as he knew them. The porter's accounts. His modest wage. No debts, no wife, no quarrels that anyone would confess to. A man who lived by order and routine, which made his vanishing all the more disorderly. I asked him whether he believed in accidents. Sometimes, he said, but not often in Oxford. We walked together towards the library, the pavement slick with rain, bicycles leaning at awkward angles against the walls. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and quietness. The librarian, a woman of angular frame and clipped sentences, told us that Harding often assisted with small errands, carrying boxes of catalogues, fetching volumes for repairs. She had seen him last on Monday. He had stood, she said, too long before the case of illuminated manuscripts, as if trying to remember something he had once known. The words unsettled me. To stand before beauty, not as one who admires, but as one who recalls. What had Hardinger known, and when had he forgotten? We found nothing in his handwriting there, no notes, no annotations, only the silence of vellum pages and the smell of leather bindings. But Lewis, again more observant than he knew, remarked that the reading lamps near the manuscripts had been left on, though the desks were unused. Someone had been careless, or someone had not wished to leave in darkness. I pocketed the program once more. Its misprint continued to press against me, insistent. If a violinist's name could be altered by a single misplaced letter, what of a porter's record in a logbook? A name struck through, rewritten, hidden by a line of ink. One letter wrong and meaning shifts. One letter absent, and the truth slips into shadow. Outside, the rain had begun again, fine and persistent. We parted at the gates, Lewis returning to the station, myself wandering aimlessly back through the quadrangles. The stones glistened with resignation. I felt the weight of the program in my pocket. As if paper could anchor a man more securely than memory. A program misprinted, a life erased. Both errors, perhaps, but neither easily corrected. It was in the senior common room again, though this time the mood was softened by wine, rather than sharpened by obligation. The fire had been coaxed into life, the smoke drawing reluctantly upward, and the smell of roasted wood mingled with the sharper scent of port. I was not expected, yet I was not unwelcome either. Oxford has always tolerated the presence of policemen when their company appears convenient. The master poured with a certain ceremony, his hand steady, but his eyes distracted. I took the glass more for observation than for thirst. Around us, fellows spoke in careful tones, their words gliding over subjects that mattered less than the silences between them. I have always thought that wine loosens the tongue, only to reveal the words already waiting at its edge. The historian spoke of Hardinger in a voice laced with irritation. A man who knows too much of people's habits, he said, should never be taken entirely at face value. The dean countered that loyalty was his defining virtue. The lecturer in French sipped quietly, her gaze fixed upon the fire. When I asked her if she had ever spoken to Harding at length, she answered with a faint smile. Once, she said, he asked me about Racine, a porter asking about tragedy. Imagine the remark was offered lightly, but it lodged in me with peculiar force. A man who lived among quays and bicycles inquiring about French tragedy. Did it matter? Perhaps not. But words are like wine, some linger, others are forgotten. I tasted the port, heavy and dark, and thought of a crossword clue left unanswered. 9 letters meaning conversation over drink. Symposium, of course. Not merely a gathering, but the sharing of wine and words until each illuminated the other. The bursar asked me whether I believed Harding had been taken against his will. I told him that I believed in will and in its quiet erosion. Men vanish not only through force, but through the slow attrition of silence, of being seen yet unseen. He looked dissatisfied with the answer, but he did not press further. It was then that the master dropped a phrase that caught my attention. Hardinger, he said, often lingered near the cellar, claiming he checked the locks for safety. We all assumed he liked the smell of corks. His tone was dismissive, yet the words clung. Why linger where no one lingers, unless there is something to be found? Later, when the gathering dissolved into fragments of conversation, I excused myself. The bursar accompanied me, his step brisk against the flagstones. He muttered that the master had a talent for concealing irritation, though not always for concealing truth. Concealing truth. We parted, and I found myself in the college cellar, its air cool and saturated with the scent of oak and dust. The racks stood in orderly rows, bottles aligned like soldiers on parade. My eyes followed the labels, some faded, some newly inked. Among them, one bottle lay misplaced, its dust disturbed, its neck angled differently from its fellows. A small detail, yet small details endure. I touched the label. A Bordeaux of modest value, but beneath it, faint initials had been penciled in. almost erased. H for Hardinge? Or merely habit? The dust told another story. Someone had handled it recently, though the rest of the rack remained undisturbed. I returned to the quadrangle with the faintest taste of port still on my tongue and the sharper taste of questions unspoken. The rain had ceased, leaving the stones slick with memory. In the lodge, I turned again to the logbook. The name struck through appeared with renewed insistence. I tried to imagine Hardinge writing it, then halting, then concealing. A man careful with words would not strike through lightly. Lewis arrived, weary from his rounds, and asked what progress had been made. I told him only that wine reveals as much as it conceals, and that words once written resist erasure. He sighed, knowing I had given him less than he wanted, and perhaps more than he understood. That night in my rooms, I unfolded the concert program once again. The misprint stared back at me, patient and uncorrected. A letter misplaced, a bottle disturbed, a word struck through, each fragment small, each waiting to be assembled, and I thought of the French lecturer's remark. A porter asking about Racine. Tragedy, after all, requires both stage and players. And somewhere behind the wine and the words, the curtain was still waiting to fall. It was Lewis who first uttered the word rival, though he did so with a hesitation that betrayed more curiosity than certainty. Rival to whom, he asked. To Hardinge? To the college? To some invisible order we were not yet invited to see? The question itself was enough to set the tone of that day. I went back through the quadrangle, under a pale sun that gave no warmth. The students were spilling from lectures, their voices brisk with youth, their scarves bright against the winter stone. For them, rivalries were obvious. Cricket matches, examinations, affections declared too openly. But for the fellows and porters of Oxford, rivalries were subtler, carried in looks withheld, in doors closed, in words that might have been better left unsaid. The bursar guided me with no little reluctance towards a certain fellow, one who had long contested the master's authority, who had spoken once too loudly of reforms that never came. He received me in his rooms where the curtains were half drawn, and the air carried the faint sour trace of pipe smoke. "You think I quarrelled with Hardinge?" he said, his voice clipped, his smile too neat. "A porter cannot be one's rival. He merely holds the keys." Yet his eyes shifted when he said it, not to the window but to the closed door behind me. I asked where he had been on the night Hardinge disappeared. The fellow produced his alibi with a flourish. "Dining with colleagues at another college," he said. "Arriving late, leaving later still, returning here well after midnight. There were witnesses enough," he insisted. He even named them. Too quickly, perhaps. I nodded and let him speak. Alibis are often rehearsed more carefully than truths. What caught my attention was not the account itself, but the untidy heap of papers on his desk. Among them lay a discarded concert program, folded in half, a faint wine stain marking its edge. He noticed my glance and swept the papers aside, a gesture more defensive than casual. I asked him if he had attended the concert. He shook his head too firmly. No time for such indulgences. And yet the program betrayed him. Why keep what one has never used? As I left, I remembered a crossword clue that had troubled me. 5 letters meaning excuse. Alibi was the obvious answer, but I considered how the word itself, borrowed from Latin, meant elsewhere. To be elsewhere is easy to claim, harder to prove. And always it leaves the question of where one truly was. Lewis was waiting in the lodge, his face flushed from the cold. He asked whether the fellow's story held weight. I told him that weight and truth are not always the same. He frowned, unused to the evasions that comfort me. He prefers facts to shadows, and yet shadows tell their own tale. We walked the cloister together, our footsteps dull against the stone. I thought again of Hardinge, the man who asked after Racine, the man who lingered by the cellar. What rivalries could such a man possess? Perhaps none of his own. But to know too much of others is a rivalry in itself. As the evening gathered, I sat once more in the senior common room, uninvited yet tolerated. The master asked in measured tones whether progress had been made. I replied only that alibis are plentiful in Oxford, as plentiful as port. He smiled thinly, and I could not tell whether the smile was meant for me or for himself. Later, alone, I unfolded again the program I carried. The misprint remained, stubborn and unchanged. 1 letter wrong and meaning shifts. 1 statement rehearsed, and the truth dissolves. Alibi elsewhere. But elsewhere is not nowhere. It is always somewhere. And so I thought of the fellow's eyes glancing at a closed door, guarding a program he should not have owned. A rival perhaps not to Hardinge, but to silence itself. And silence, I have learned, is the most dangerous rival of all. It was Lewis who first mentioned her, almost apologetically, as though he suspected my patience for theatre extended no further than the crossword's occasional allusion to Hamlet. Hardinger, he said, had been seen once or twice in the company of an actress, middle-aged, well-regarded in the sort of productions that Oxford summons for festivals no one outside remembers. The bursar confirmed it with a slight grimace. Not quite respectable, he said, for a porter to be consorting with performers. I found myself wondering what, in his mind, respectability amounted to, and whether it had ever offered a man much consolation. I sought her in a draughty rehearsal room near Beaumont Street. The afternoon light slanted across boards stained with the marks of past performances, the scent of dust and grease paint as intimate as incense. She stood by the window, cigarette in hand, a woman no longer young yet not wholly resigned to the passing of time. Her eyes lingered on me longer than politeness required, and when she spoke it was with a mixture of defiance and weariness. "You've come about Hardinger. They always come about someone, never for them. I told her he was missing." She smiled thinly. "He was always missing, even when he stood beside you." She offered me a chair that creaked in protest as I sat. Her words came measured, rehearsed perhaps, though not without truth. Hardinger, she said, admired theatre as a man admires a church in which he cannot quite believe. He came not for the plays themselves, but for the silences between them, when actors stood half-shadowed, waiting for their cue. He liked the waiting more than the speaking. I asked what he had spoken of with her. "Wine," she said, "words, loneliness, once Racine." She laughed softly at that. A porter who knew tragedy by instinct, though not by book. Her laugh echoed oddly in the room, fragile as dust in a shaft of light. I thought of a crossword clue I had abandoned that morning. 10 letters, meaning confession. Admission came too easily. Revelation too grand. Testimony, I realized. The voice that speaks not for itself, but for what it has witnessed. And here she was, giving testimony not to facts, but to impressions, those fragile things more enduring than evidence. She drew on her cigarette and said Hardinge once told her he had seen something he should not have. She pressed him, but he refused to say what. Instead, he asked her about betrayal in drama. Did the actor feel it, or only the audience? She had no answer then. She had none now. The rehearsal room was empty, but for us, yet I sensed unseen listeners, the ghosts of lines once spoken, the echo of scenes played too often. She stubbed out her cigarette with deliberate force and asked whether I thought he was dead. I told her only that absence is sometimes more dangerous than death. She nodded as though she had known that always. When I rose to leave, she touched my arm lightly, a gesture almost maternal. "Beware of men who linger where they are not wanted," she said. Hardinger lingered, but so do others. I carried her words back through the streets, past bookshops and chapels, their windows dim in the gathering dusk. The city felt like a stage stripped of its scenery, only the boards remaining. Lewis waited at the station, impatient for my verdict. I told him the actress had spoken, though not in the way he would wish. "She gave me no facts," I said. "Only testimony." He sighed, muttering that testimony won't find a man. Perhaps not, I thought. But sometimes it is the only map we are given. That night I opened the concert program once more. The misprinted name stared back at me, stubborn as ever. A misplaced letter, a mistaken identity, a misheard line. Even theatre thrives on error. The actress had spoken, but her words were less confession than performance, as though Hardinge himself had scripted them. And I remembered her question. Does betrayal belong to the actor or the audience? Perhaps it belongs to both. Perhaps it belongs to anyone who lingers too long in silence, waiting for a cue that never comes. The bursar's office smelled of old ink and nervous calculation, the kind of place where every page trembles with the weight of what it owes and what it conceals. He had resisted my presence there for several days, but eventually I was allowed to stand among the ledgers, the thick volumes that recorded, not only pounds and shillings, but the rhythm of lives. The bursar said coldly that no porter ever entered here. I answered that sometimes one need not enter to know. He looked at me without expression, his hand closing over the brass clasp of a book as if to prevent me from opening it. Yet he opened it himself slowly, revealing columns of neat figures, the handwriting precise, the margins ruled as carefully as any chapel service. Among the entries, I noticed a name circled faintly, as though erased once and restored again. The family that had sponsored the concert, the same name I had seen in the program. A loan had been recorded, small in the scale of college finances but larger than Hardinger's yearly wage. Paid out, not yet returned. I asked who received it. The bursar shifted in his chair. For college improvements, he said, routine, but the ink betrayed him, Harding's name, written faintly in the margin, then crossed with a trembling hand. I asked why a porter's name should appear in a bursar's ledger. He insisted it must be error, a misentry. Yet I knew Hardinger wrote carefully. Even in the logbook his hand was slow, deliberate, never careless. I thought again of the misprinted program, of the anagram hidden in plain sight. Sometimes error is no accident, but intention disguised as clumsiness. Lewis entered, his presence welcome if only to unsettle the bursar. He glanced over the pages, his lips moving as he read, then looked to me with puzzlement. Why would a man like Hardinger be entrusted with a sum he could never repay? Unless the debt was not his but someone else's, recorded in his stead. I recalled a crossword clue from the morning paper. 4 letters meaning note of debt. IOU, of course. The simplest of answers, and yet the least satisfying. For the ledger in front of me was not simple. It was not an IOU but a map of obligations, shifting from one name to another, so that no one could tell where the burden truly lay. The bursar rose to end the interview. You pursue shadows, he said. Hardinger was a servant, nothing more. If he wrote his name in my books, it was in error. I closed the volume gently and told him that servants often know more of their masters than masters care to imagine. His face hardened, but he said nothing further. Outside, the air carried the bitter smell of coal smoke, the afternoon sinking towards dusk. Lewis asked whether I believed Hardinger had borrowed the money. I told him I believed in loans, yes, but not always in repayment. Sometimes the loan is not of money, but of silence, of loyalty, of a name written where it should not be, and such loans are rarely repaid without interest. We walked across the quadrangle, the stones wet with a rain that had fallen unseen. The chapel bell struck the hour, each note echoing as though down a corridor that never ended. I thought of Hardinger standing before those manuscripts, of his questions about tragedy, a man aware of debts greater than coins. That night in my rooms I opened my own small ledger, the crossword. 7 letters meaning obligation, binding, I realized suddenly. Not debt, not loan, but the thing that ties one to another, whether by money or silence or fear. I poured a whiskey and stared at the program yet again. The misprint remained, a stubborn letter out of place. Ledger records, a loan binds, a misprint misleads, and somewhere in those errors lay the outline of a man who had disappeared. The bursar had spoken of shadows, but shadows follow figures and figures leave ledgers, and I, listening to the creak of my floorboards and the faint hum of the city beyond, wondered how long a man can bear the weight of someone else's debt before he chooses to vanish beneath it. The archive lay beneath the library, a room carved from stone and silence. I remember the smell most of all, dust mingled with the faint sourness of old polish, the perfume of forgotten paper. The archivist, a man as pale as the bindings he guarded, admitted me reluctantly, his keys jangling like punctuation marks to his speech. He spoke of catalogues and permissions, of requests filed months in advance. But when I asked of photographs, his resistance softened. Photographs, he admitted, are rarely requested, and so they are rarely missed. We stood before drawers labelled with years. He slid one open, his hand careful, as though the photographs might break if disturbed too suddenly. I leafed through the stiff cards. Group portraits of fellows, theatrical productions, rowing crews blurred in the shimmer of water. And then I saw it, the Porter's Lodge 30 years earlier. Hardinger stood at its edge, younger, thinner, his face unlined. Yet it was not Harding who caught my attention, but the figure beside him. A man in academic gown, smiling too widely, his hand on Harding's shoulder. The master, though younger, his gaze already trained upon the lens as though the world were made for his scrutiny. I studied the photograph too long. The archivist coughed softly, impatient with my reverie. I asked whether copies had ever been taken. He shook his head. Few care for porters' faces, he said. I slipped the photograph back, though my mind carried it still, sharper than any negative. Outside the air was damp, the pavements shining with the recent rain. Lewis waited by the gate, stamping his feet for warmth. I showed him nothing, but described enough. "A photograph of Hardinger," I said, "in the company of those who would rather forget him." Lewis frowned. "What does a photograph prove?" I answered that it proves only what was once seen, not what was meant. We walked together through the cloister. I asked him whether he recalled the crossword clue from the morning. 6 letters meaning record of a likeness. He muttered portrait. "Too short. Sketch?" Still wrong. Then I told him image, from the Latin imitare to copy. And what is a photograph if not an image? A copy of something that refuses to remain the same. That evening I studied the concert program once more. The misprint, the names, the sponsors, and now the photograph intruded, an image of companionship that had curdled with time. Hardinger, whose life appeared so spare, had once stood beside men of power. Was it loyalty or leverage or merely accident? Later in the senior common room, I asked the master whether he remembered a photograph of himself with Hardinge. His glass paused halfway to his lips. "A photograph?" he repeated, as though the word itself tasted strange. "Many photographs, I suppose. College life is full of them." His hand trembled faintly as he set the glass down. I said nothing further. Silence is often the most effective cross-examination. When I left, the night had settled, the stones glistening beneath a thin drizzle. The chapel bell tolled, each note dissolving into the damp air. I imagined Hardinger's face, caught in that single frame, unaware how long it would survive him. In my rooms, with a whiskey in hand, I returned to the crossword. 8 letters meaning reminder. "Keepsake," I wrote, and then struck it out. For a photograph is not a keepsake, but an accusation. It reminds not of what is cherished, but of what refuses to disappear. The photograph in the archive proved nothing, and yet it proved too much. A porter standing too close to those who would prefer distance. A record no ledger could erase, no alibi could improve. And I, staring at the damp blur of my window, wondered whether Harding had known all along that his likeness would outlast his presence. Oxford by night is never entirely quiet. The wind slips through cloisters. Bicycle chains rattle against iron rails. Distant voices echo from pubs along George Street. Yet there are moments when the silence becomes too perfect, so calculated that it seems almost designed. That evening, walking back through the quadrangle after leaving the archivist, I felt it settle upon me. An absence not merely of sound, but of witness. The lodge, still lit, appeared unchanged. Lewis was inside, bent over the logbook as though stubborn reading might release its secrets. He looked up when I entered. "Nothing new," he said. "Only the same names, the same hours." He tapped the line where Hardinger had written and struck through. I told him we should stop staring at ink and listen instead to what the silence itself was telling us. He asked me what silence could tell. "Too much," I said, "and sometimes too little." We sat in the porter's chair, the air carrying the faint odor of damp coats. Lewis spoke of his mother's cottage, where silence always meant safety. I told him silence here meant danger. Colleges thrive on murmur, debate in the hall, quarrels in committee. Gossip whispered along staircases. For the lodge to fall into such perfect hush was unnatural, as though the building itself was holding its breath. I remembered a crossword clue from that morning. 7 letters meaning stillness. Quietus fitted too neatly, though the word signified not only stillness but death. The silence around Hardinge had that same quality, not absence of noise but presence of something final. The master appeared, wrapped in his gown, his footsteps unnervingly soundless across the stone. He asked why we lingered. I told him only that a porter missing left an echo one could not ignore. His reply was sharp. "Echoes fade, Inspector. They serve no purpose." I watched his face as he said it. He believed it. Yet he had been the one to glance too long at a wine stain, the one to tremble when I mentioned the photograph. He was a man rehearsed in the art of silence, but not perfect in its execution. Later, when Lewis had gone, I remained in the quadrangle. A single window glowed faintly in the library, though the building was closed. I walked towards it, the gravel crunching beneath my feet. The door was locked, yet the silence on the other side was too deliberate, like a stage awaiting its actors. Through the glass I thought I saw movement, but when I blinked it was gone. I stayed there longer than reason demanded. My coat collar turned up against the drizzle, and I considered again the actress's words. Beware of men who linger where they are not wanted. Hardinger lingered, but so do others. Perhaps the silence I felt was not his absence, but someone else's presence, sustained, patient, perfect. Back in my rooms, I opened the photograph once more in memory, though I had left it in the archive. Harding with the master, shoulder to shoulder, both staring outward. What kind of silence had bound them then? Complicity, gratitude, debt? And had that silence grown so perfect? It demanded the removal of the man who disturbed it. I poured myself a whiskey, the liquid pooling gold in the lamplight. The crossword still lay unfinished. 10 letters meaning secrecy. Reticence, I wrote, then paused. Reticence is not silence. Reticence is the choice not to speak, while silence, when too perfect, may be imposed. The city around me hummed faintly, distant cars, a dog barking along Cowley Road, the hum of pipes in the wall. And yet beneath it, I heard again that college silence, so absolute it seemed carved from stone. Harding had vanished into it, or perhaps he had been swallowed by it. I could not tell. What I knew was only this: silence in Oxford was never neutral. It was shaped, rehearsed, perfected. A silence too perfect is not silence at all. It is theatre waiting for its cue. And in that silence, I found myself listening, as if a voice might yet emerge, faint and reluctant, breaking the hush that had grown so carefully around his name. She sent for me late. The message delivered on cheap paper, folded twice, the ink running at its edges as if ashamed of itself. The rehearsal room, she wrote. Tonight after dark. I found her where she had been before, though the air was colder now and her coat clung more tightly around her shoulders. The faint trace of cigarette smoke hung in the rafters, like memory refusing to clear. She did not rise when I entered. She only said in that same voice, half trained for performance, half wearied by life, that she was tired of waiting. I asked her what she waited for. For silence to crack, she answered. For you to listen, not only to what is said, but to what is hidden between. She spoke slowly, choosing each word as if it were part of a script rehearsed too often in solitude. Hardinger had confided in her more than once, she said. Not the facts, he was too cautious for that, but fragments, impressions, the faint outline of something larger than himself. He feared he had seen too much. He feared that silence was not safety, but complicity. She looked at me with eyes sharpened by fatigue. He told me once, she said, that the master would do anything to protect the college, anything. She paused, then laughed softly, bitterly, as though the college were more fragile than flesh. Her confession did not come in a rush. It arrived in pauses, in hesitations, in the slow exhalation of smoke. She admitted that Hardinger had visited her on the night he vanished. He had spoken of ledgers, of names struck through, of debts that did not belong to him. He left her abruptly, saying he must return to the lodge. She never saw him again. I asked why she had not spoken sooner. Because, she said, actresses know the danger of lines delivered too early. They are ignored, or they are silenced. The room grew quiet. Only the faint creak of the floorboards accompanied us. I thought of a crossword clue I had abandoned that morning. 8 letters meaning disclosure. Confession seemed obvious but too plain. Avowal, perhaps, stronger, more deliberate. The actress's words were less confession than avowal, spoken not to be forgiven but to be preserved. She stubbed out her cigarette and folded her hands, the gesture almost pious. She asked whether I believed her. I told her belief was a luxury I seldom allowed myself. She smiled faintly. Then take this not as belief, but as warning. When I left the rehearsal room, the rain had begun again, light but insistent, tapping against the windows of closed shops. The city seemed emptied of voices, the silence too perfect once more. I carried her words with me, not certain whether they clarified or only thickened the fog. Lewis met me in the quadrangle, impatient, his collar turned up against the drizzle. He asked what she had said. I told him she spoke of debts, of silence, of fear. He frowned. That's no confession, he muttered. That's only theatre. I answered that theatre is often truer than fact. He shook his head, unpersuaded. Back in my rooms I poured whiskey, though it tasted dull against the evening's weight. I laid out the fragments, the misprinted program, the ledger with its faint erasure, the photograph in the archive, the silence too perfect, and now the actress's confession. Each piece incomplete, yet each resisting dismissal. I returned to the crossword. 9 letters meaning truth revealed. Revelation, I wrote, and let it stand, though I doubted it. For her confession had not revealed truth. It had only deepened its shadows. In the quiet I imagined her voice again, that mixture of defiance and resignation. Silence is not safety. Silence is complicity. And I wondered whether Hardinger had known this, whether it was knowledge that had drawn him into absence. The whiskey glass stood empty. The rain continued, indifferent, steady against the glass. Her confession lingered, less absolution than accusation. And I, alone with its echo, could not decide whether she had spoken too late, or precisely when she intended. There are certain sounds that do not belong in Oxford at night. A bicycle bell where no bicycles pass, a window slammed in a windless hour, and laughter, too bright, too sudden, spilling into cloisters made for silence. It was laughter that reached me first that evening, faint but unmistakable, drifting from the senior common room as Lewis and I crossed the quadrangle. Inside, a small gathering lingered around the fire, the remains of wineglasses arranged like chessmen awaiting their next move. Their laughter ceased the moment we entered, not abruptly but in that careful way that suggests more than interruption. The historian leaned back, still smiling faintly, as though unwilling to surrender the last echo. The French lecturer lowered her eyes, her hand resting lightly on the stem of her glass. The master looked irritated, though not surprised. I asked what occasion they found so amusing. The historian replied that it was nothing more than an anecdote from his undergraduate days. The dean added that Oxford thrives on laughter, else it would drown in its own pretension. The master said nothing. Yet the room had grown heavy, the air thickened by the laughter that no longer belonged. Later, walking back through the cloister, Lewis muttered that laughter in itself is no crime. I told him laughter is never innocent when it falls where grief should reside. A porter missing, a silence too perfect, and yet they laugh. He frowned, unpersuaded, but he did not argue further. That night I returned to the logbook, my eyes drawn again to the line struck through. I had seen it too often, but this time I noticed what I had missed before. Hardinger's hand faltered, not on the name itself but on the letter R, repeated, overemphasized as though the pen had paused in hesitation, an R too long, an R too deep. Perhaps it was nothing. But laughter too can be nothing, until it echoes where it should not. A crossword clue intruded, as they often did. 5 letters meaning amusement. Mirth came easily, but too lightly. What I heard tonight was not mirth, but mockery. Derisive, concealed. A laughter that wished to erase, not to remember. The following afternoon I visited the actress once more. She greeted me with weariness, her eyes ringed by smoke. I told her of the laughter. She nodded slowly. He hated laughter, she said of Hardinger. Or rather, he hated being the subject of it. He once told me that Oxford laughs not at jokes, but at people. She stubbed out her cigarette with unnecessary force. If they laughed, she said, they laughed because they knew.
When I left her, the rain had begun again, fine needles stitching the pavements to the river. I walked without purpose, yet my feet drew me back to the quadrangle. The silence there felt heavier now, as though pressed down by the laughter it had momentarily carried. I paused by the chapel. Its door stood ajar, the faint sound of an organ drifting outward, uncertain in its notes as though rehearsing. Inside, the dean practiced alone. He looked up, startled to see me, then smiled too readily. "A hymn for Sunday," he explained. His hands rested on the keys, though the notes he had struck still trembled faintly in the air. I asked him whether he had laughed last night. He replied that laughter is balm, Inspector, in times of unease. But his voice betrayed no balm. It carried defensiveness, the echo of something rehearsed. That evening, with whiskey at hand, I tried to assemble the fragments. A misprinted program, a ledger with a loan unreturned, a photograph half forgotten, an actress's confession, and now this laughter, echoing too perfectly. Each fragment was small, yet each refused to be dismissed. The crossword lay unfinished on my desk. 7 letters, meaning sound repeated. Echo, I wrote, though too short. Refrain, perhaps. And I thought again of the laughter. An echo, a refrain, repeating itself even in silence. Oxford at night returned to its hush, the quadrangles damp, the libraries closed, the bells marking hours that no one wished to count. Yet in the quiet I heard it still, the echo of laughter, misplaced, lingering, uninvited. And I wondered whether it was laughter at a joke, or at a man who had vanished into their silence.